Good morning. Since the Council's beginning in 1986, we have seen over and over, time and again, how technology has transformed our lives and unleashed new challenges and new opportunities as we think about a new future for the United States. 2003 was such a period of change. 17 years after our founding, our council members recognized that the nation stood at a particular inflection point. We needed significant change to enhance our innovation capacity, and that led to the pioneering work of our National Innovation Initiative. And now, another 17 years later, here we are again, once again finding ourselves at the precipice of transformational change. Throughout the day, as Deborah mentioned in her opening remarks, we're going to hear stories about these changes as they are foundational to our flagship National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. The commission, co-chaired by the Council Board on this stage, is a multi-year effort to reimagine America's innovation potential and to chart a new path for competitiveness in the 21st century. And as this slide shows, just a little less than a year ago, with our core leadership team, we began to build this effort. And by August, we had pulled together a powerful and diverse set of commissioners, nearly 60 leaders from across this country, from industry, from academia, from our labor union community, and our national labs. And the commission has already started their work. As Deborah mentioned, today's release of launch is our 2020 roadmap of activities that will, and we hope, change the future trajectory of American innovation capacity. And to make all of this happen, this fall we have built a growing, blossoming community of hundreds of advisors, communication leaders, and innovation practitioners who will create over the coming year this new innovation agenda and this new movement for America. This morning, our commission leadership is going to share their top priorities for this go-forward strategy. And Mehmood, I'd like to turn to you first. Looking at a future centered around a more sustainable approach to production and consumption and the benefits that would accrue to greater attention there, you have to be concerned about our nation's stagnation and investments in long-term R&D. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as the risk of this stagnation and what might be the opportunities if we were to reignite our investments in long-term R&D?
Thank you. Look, I think we touched on it within Deborah's comments, but let me just frame it up again. Any country, and in particular the United States, has led the world in terms of economic growth and development for its citizens based on innovation. There is no innovation without invention, and every innovation starts as something, a process, a product, an ingredient that was invented. That requires R&D investment. Every invention is based on significant investment into the R&D ecosystem. And it is up to other sectors then to take those inventions and translate them into applications in society. So much of the benefit we as a country have achieved from this has started with that R&D investment. If we go back over the last 5-6 decades, the U.S. was the primary driver in the world of R&D investment. More than half of the world's R&D investment happened in the United States across our ecosystem: universities, national laboratories, different government bodies, and of course the private sector. Today, China accounts for 1/4 of R&D investment on the planet, just over. We're now at about 1/4. We have about 20% more investment annually than China does, and that gap continues to narrow. When that happens, we no longer have the fuel that will drive the future innovations and ultimately the job creation, the opportunities that go with an innovation ecosystem.
Thanks, Mehmood. You talked about the China challenge, and we see a squeeze here in the U.S. on the fundamental side on the long-term research. And I think the other squeeze is on the other side. China, while it's investing less overall in the U.S., is investing much more in the application and the development. And I think that triggers, and I'd like, Michael, for your comments on this, we have to maybe rethink our model. And Michael, you provocatively called for and launched a modernization model for America, that we have to be unbelievably creative in thinking about our future. Could you talk about what you think is required to be unbelievably creative? What might that model look like in the future? And how is this commission poised to help us think through and present to the United States a new way of thinking about innovation?
Yeah, thanks for the small question there. So let's back up a little bit. The census will report 335 million people, most diverse country in the world, unbelievable complexity, everything you can possibly imagine. We're still living off of the successes of the past, the fumes of the past to some extent in terms of our designs of the past. And so we wake up today with this democracy that's evolving at this rapid rate socially and culturally. We wake up today with true global competitors, which I think is good news for the planet and good news for humanity going forward. And that means then that we have to go and look at how do we modernize everything? How do we modernize our institutions of higher education? How do we modernize the entire educational system? How do we change the notion that education is a sector as opposed to a responsibility for all sectors? Mm-hmm. How do we move forward in a way where we start embracing the notion that human capital, for instance, taking that as one example, that human capital is in fact an objective of every organization, human capital development, human capital enhancement. How do we find ways to modernize, use technologies? How do we create opportunities for people to learn across the entirety of their life seamlessly? How can they move in and out of formal educational experiences? How can they get recognition and credit for informal educational experiences? How can we empower 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds in the future who are healthy and are at their peak wisdom moment and want to give back? And how do we engage all of that together? So what we have is we have an archaic, segmented, fragmented, isolated, sector-driven model. We don't have connections. We don't have linkages, and we have now the means and the capability and the tools to do all these things. We just have to look at the fact that our systems are antiquated, they're underperforming, and just accept that. It's a weird thing to me to watch people go in. It's like sending in line after line after line after line of people and say, we need to make K-12 better. No, you need to make K-12 different. You need to rethink it from the very core. You need to rethink some universities and some colleges. You need to rethink how they work. We've been doing this at my institution with some progress, not at warp 8, but maybe at a little bit better than impulse power. And so point being, relative to modernization, we have to basically face up to the fact that the country has matured socially and culturally. The world has matured economically and competitively, and now is the moment for us for this next burst of modernization across all aspects of what we do.
Brian, I'd like to turn to you now and perhaps build and riff a little bit off of Michael's point around modernization. As we think about modernizing America, optimizing our environment for innovation, what is your vision for regulatory or other reforms that are going to be necessary to help support and enable entrepreneurs and innovative activity?
Well, I think the key point is embedded in what was just talked about, which is the structure of the world's economies are much different. So when we talk about comparing ourselves to China and innovation, R&D dollars and stuff, the issue is if the basic principle is we have to be the worldwide leader because we're the largest economy, we want to grow, the end of the day is that's not the right comparison. The right comparison is how much more do we have to spend to maintain that position. So that's a construct. The second construct is there's great final demand and a much different set of talent than 17 years ago when you looked at this question. The Chinese economy 17 years ago was probably about $1.5 trillion, right. $2 trillion, and now it's 14, which people think of it one way, but the reality is that means the structure has changed dramatically in terms of final demand and consumption. India, China, and these, so the European, U.S. sort of dominance there is changing. And against that, what do you think about? Well, we used to lead the standard setting, whether it was pollution or whether car safety. How do you lead the standard setting when it's about data and information and privacy? And how do you think about that? And how do you lead it when there's two systems developing? And how are we going to be able to interface into that system? And what regulations are going to allow all of us who are in the national and global business chains to actually interface with economies or in a different environment that we have and how we work about it. So if you really think sort of near-term legislation, I'd focus on a couple things. One is the research funding, which my other colleagues will talk about. An example of driving that is what the executive order earlier this year, artificial intelligence and the emergence around that in the defense infrastructure and stuff and funding. Those are important elements. Another thing is I think we have to keep our eye on revitalizing patent reform. And Deborah mentioned earlier, and not only in trade negotiations, but what it means and with the duration and other things to get the payback period so innovation dollars keep coming, because the world has benefited by the U.S.'s innovation. So we have to think about patent reform completely differently now, where there's final demand in different business systems. And then you have tax. And the near-term issue, and Deborah mentioned earlier, is with these deficits, at some point there's going to become a review of where can they collect money. And there's two ways to collect money: raise the rates, which could happen, and then you have the problem of the competitiveness of the American tax rate against the world, where the world is much more interesting to companies for final demand and things. That's sort of one issue. But the second issue is also what incentives you take out. And so we can't lose the incentives for R&D, obviously. You can't lose the incentives for alternative new energy sources and things like that, which are major drivers of activity. But when people need money, those things can go. And then the other thing is you got to remember the charitable deduction and things like that. So the university system, which gets a lot of funding from charities to do this innovation, if you start taking away, or tax or endowments, you start taking away the resources. So one of the things we have to be careful is it's not just tax rate where everybody gets focused, or it's the issue of what the incentives are and how do we preserve them. And so I think about it, sort of intellectual property, trade negotiations and how that's protected, the duration of that, the tax policy and not losing incentives. Those are the key sort of regulatory legislative areas I think about.
Brian, can I just follow up on one point? In launch, many of the issues you just raised are teased out, but another one that comes up is really around capital cost structure. Right. Is the United States poised to compete globally with our current capital cost structure? Are we going to be able to build the innovation infrastructure of the future where we are today?
Well, I think we have to study that. We shouldn't say we all have the answers up here. The idea is we're commissioning groups to go out and look at it. But inherently, we have the deepest capital markets and the best capital formation. So I think the question is not that, is making sure we hold on to that. But that is also emerging in other countries. So we have to be careful that the amount of private equity around the world and the amount of private equity from the United States is willing to go around the world because the rules are clear and stuff. But I think we have to step back. There was just an article that said 1% of counties in the U.S. have 30% of GDP. So one of the things we have to think about is how the capital formation and the benefits of it are distributed better. We have the issue of human capital that Michael mentioned, that how do we make sure it participates across the board. So I think not only we have to think about the cost of capital, we have to think about how the capital, and we can't have capital formation deserts. We can't have all the private equity and all the innovation funding basically in 7 major counties and not anywhere else, because it's just going to be problematic. We won't get the depth of talent. So I think not only the capital return is there, the money's there, I would never worry about that. We got to watch the incentives I talked about before. But the real question is, are we really paying attention to how we drive that and distribute it? And then also, to Michael's point on human capital, the human capital change that has to occur continuously is much different than the past dimension. So are we reinvesting in that human capital availability? And so I think we have to think about that capital more broadly.
Well, let's stick on the human capital point that you and Michael have both raised, Brian, and Lonnie, turn to you. Really interested in how you, the IBEW, are thinking about that future human capital. What ideas are you all generating to think, how do we train and reskill and equip American workers for this future innovation space?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The skill sets that's going to be needed for the workers of the future are much different than they are today. And so we're constantly working on updating in our construction branch, the way we train, the type of work that they're doing is much different. I visited one of our training centers just a couple of weeks ago, and they are actually starting to do some virtual type training where you put on the headset and you're able to simulate going through some operations, open up a cabinet, checking the connections, and if you do something wrong, it's going to be an explosion that's going to tell you did something wrong. So we're continuing to change the way we do the training so they get it really in more, like I said, in reality of what they're going to have when they're out in the field. Also on our other branches, even manufacturing and others, it's a different skill set in the future manufacturing as well because of, the continuing of expansion of robotics and other changes. These workers need to have a different training, a different skill set to be able to adjust to those type of jobs. We work very close with our employers and all of our branches and developing. We're constantly changing and innovating what we do to meet the needs of the future as technologies change. We work together with them and making sure that their employees, our members, are getting the proper training to be prepared for what's to come in the future.
Thanks, Lonnie. And I know you're representing nearly 750,000 workers across the country. I'd like to stay on this workforce and skills of the future issue, and maybe open it up for the panel to chime in. You know, everyone up here is engaged with workforces that are doing very different things, probably very different than they were 2 to 3 years ago. So any other thoughts on what does future of work look like and how our commission might really think about leveraging what in some sense could be a demographic advantage in the United States? I don't know, Michael or...
Well, we just trademarked at my university the phrase universal learner and universal learning, and we did that in opposition to the concept of universal income. And just taking, not on a political basis, but on an economic basis, the notion that somehow we're going to give up on the ability of people to be able to perform for high compensation levels or increasing compensation levels in the economy of the future. So then we're going to tax those that are making more resources and then move those taxes to people who are no longer able to perform in the economy. We might as well give up if we move in that direction. And so the notion that we have is, how do we create an opportunity across all organizations, across a person's entire life, to be engaged in the opportunity for universal learning, all stages of life, all aspects, everything. That will require all of our institutions to rethink themselves. That will require corporations to rethink themselves, the government, the schools, the universities, everybody. And the notion of moving human capital to be as important as financial capital, as important as natural capital, and raising its status and rethinking the whole thing is what we need to do. That will require all of us to rethink everything.
Brian, Mehmood,
two aspects.
Go ahead and then I'll come.
Two aspects. That one, that dialogue also fits with all the research that's being done on aging and things like that. We've done a lot of work with people on this, and people are never going to stop working. So there's also an intellectual societal demand to keep learning and working. And people are going to are living to mid-80s to 90s. They don't want to stop at 60. Lonnie and I were talking about earlier about the retirement and the second career. So to match the education process, or whatever the exact term to use, against that. And I think that's something we in the commission need to be thinking about, which is how do you reinvent careers all the way along. And so that's one thing. The second thing, I think the way we should judge success in terms of innovation and competitiveness of the world is not necessarily only the median income and the top incomes and all the stuff like that. It's really, we in the United States should have the best starting jobs. They should be the best jobs in the world, and they should be a standard of living the world envies. That's what we should be making sure, because then everything else is gravy, right? And they should be growing, and they should be doing, and that might be completely different than the jobs that were available in our company 20 years ago. But so we're starting at the starting wage for our employees next quarter is $40,000 a year for everybody, even a kid working for the summer. So, but the amount of work they have, the productivity they have to have, let us work, they all work hard. To pay for that takes the innovation in the process. So I think we have to remember that the goal is not to produce the people who end up on top, because that's going to kind of take care of it. So the goal is to bring everybody's standard of living to be the envy of the world, and we've lost that as the core goal in some ways.
That's a great point.
Let me just build on the 2 points, and we're not talking about hypothetical or theoretical. Let me give a statistic, which I think will crystallize this. For the first time in the history of humanity today, there are more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. It's never happened before. So the global population pyramid is now inverted. If you're a 5-year-old, whether it's your child or grandchild, and you fast forward 15 years from now, there's going to be a young workforce that is having to take care of more people over the age of 75 and 80 than they've ever had to do. And in fact, there's more people to take care of than people who are working, if we don't change anything. So for the leadership of this country and across the world, we have to ask ourselves, do we sit and twiddle our thumbs, or just look at that statistic and say, what are we leaving behind? And more importantly, who's going to take care of us? And we have to change this for ourselves, not for that generation, because we're putting way too much burden on a young generation of 5-year-olds who are going to become 20-year-olds, taking care of a lot of 75 and 80-year-olds. So what are our options? Well, we can watch the economic impact of that, or come up with a very different construct for education, because just because you turn 60 doesn't mean it's mandatory retirement. And there are still professions where at 60 to 65, there's mandatory retirement. Doesn't make sense anymore. I'll give you an example. Currently, every air traffic controller in the country is on mandatory overtime. Don't have enough. We know there's a crisis in pilots, aircraft mechanics. I can go on and on. There are a lot of opportunities to retrain, redevelop. Smart people can get redeployed. And what's it going to take? It's going to take the leadership represented by the sectors at this table and in this room to actually say, what's that new construct for employers, for educators, and policymakers? So this can't be done in isolation, but it is happening now. We shouldn't be thinking about this as something that's going to happen in the future. Anybody with a young child, ask yourself what that future will look like.
Just to build on what is discussed already, I think that the way you approach learning has to evolve dramatically. I mean, the idea that you can go to school, learn something that is static, and build out a complete career is no longer true. You have to constantly learn, and you have to be taught to learn continuously. And I think this is why it's also important to actually educate, whether it is in technical schools or universities, in a much more research-intensive environment. Because when you are learning in a research-intensive environment, you're being taught for the workforce of the future. Whereas if you're not, because research in of itself is driving innovation, so you are actually learning in an environment where they are focused on the future. So I think it's really important to make sure that not only traditional universities, but also working at the interface of universities, national laboratories, industry, work towards creating a curricula that not only teaches you how to learn continuously, but also in a research-intensive environment so that you're working, you're being trained for the jobs of the future.
Thanks, Thomas. Deborah, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in. I know we've done a lot of work in this space. We actually have a major report called Work, which encapsulates nearly 20 years of efforts, but I know this is an issue close to your heart and obviously fundamental to our efforts.
Well, I know we're going to talk about this later in the day, the importance of our STEM pipeline and workforce, but also ensuring that the next generation also has what we call the traditional education of the liberal arts, the social sciences, the humanities, because so many of the issues we're going to be dealing with do take that type of higher value thinking and also the creativity and imagination that come from the arts and things. So that's something as well that we need to make sure, starting, pre-K and all the way up, that we value the liberal arts as well as ensuring that we have more Americans that have the quantifiable skills that infuse every component of work as well.
Thomas, I want to pivot just a little bit, although it's connected. You lead one of the nation's preeminent national laboratories, really crown jewels of our innovation infrastructure in this country. But as Michael mentioned in August at our meeting where we developed Launch, what we want to do with this commission is not just focus on a national innovation system, but on, in some sense, building on the assets around the country and optimizing for many different types of innovation systems. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about your thinking as to how you're trying to turbocharge your own region and what lessons we might potentially take back to the nation?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. Let me start by just giving you an anecdote. When I was a practicing scientist in the mid-90s, I had the privilege of working on one of the fastest computers in the world. It's an Intel Paragon. There were one in Oak Ridge, another one in Sandia. It required a major economy like the United States, a major national laboratory, a laboratory system to field that, and it cost hundreds of millions of dollars. If you have an iPhone 6 or better, you have a device that is faster than the fastest supercomputer in the world about 20 years ago. And there are about 2 billion such units worldwide. So there is a democratization of innovation. And the idea that we can compete globally just based on the intense innovation that occurs about 24 counties in the United States spread along the coast, I think is not scalable or sustainable. In fact, there are a number of reports. The Brookings has something called the Growth Centers, or Jumpstarting America is another book. All of these, the idea is that instead of an innovation system, you really need many more innovation centers across Middle America, cities that have the ability and the potential to step up and be part of the solution. And as was mentioned, I lead Oak Ridge National Laboratory, but I'm one of 17 such national laboratories spread across the United States. And just for my own understanding, I tried to overlay this national labs along the sort of, 30 or 40 cities that are sort of ready to be, it has most of the ingredients to be part of the solution. And the reality is that at the intersection of national laboratories, universities, and these cities that already have much of the ecosystem that is necessary is a tremendous opportunity to jumpstart innovation. And that's something that we are working on. If you think about Oak Ridge, Department of Energy, not just Oak Ridge National Laboratory, but between Y-12 and the cleanup mission, Department of Energy invests about $4.5 billion in Knoxville, Oak Ridge area. The University of Tennessee is about $2 billion. And the Tennessee Valley Authority that is located at Oak Ridge is about, or Knoxville, is a $10 billion utility, regional utility. There has to be a way to bring these assets together to be part of the solution. And I think that's a really important attribute that one needs to pursue.
Well, Michael, I don't know if you also want to comment on this. As you raised the point back in August about innovation systems, but perhaps talk a little bit about the transformation you're seeing in the Southwest that you're leading, and I think to Thomas's point, how do we really begin to turbocharge other regions across the country to contribute to our the innovation story?
Yeah, so the key everywhere is to break down the fixed model. So the fixed model says you retire at 65. That's stupid. The fixed model says you're only educated building up to go to college, and then you're done with your education. And so one of the advantages in a place like Arizona, where I've been living the last 17, 18 years, is nobody believes in anything there. They're open-minded to everything, and that's a good thing. They don't believe in government. They don't believe in this. They don't believe in that. That's all good. And what that means then is that you can then step back and then just start assembling groups of people, assembling groups of institutions to rethink things. And so we've brought in 300 private sector educational technology companies and embedded them into the university so that now we're probably pound for pound 10 times more efficient than we ever were before, impacting people's lives. So the notion then is all of us in all of our institutions, all of our sectors, and all of our places, if we want to innovate, you've got to go back to the design. There's no innovation that's a function of tweaking something. It is about the design of the institutions, the design of the relationships between the institutions, the design of the government, the design of the universities. And so one of the things that we found in our neck of the woods down in the Southwest is openness to questioning and looking at and reshaping the design, from which then we're getting dramatic enhancements of outcome.
Brian, did you want to make a comment?
So just to follow that on, as you go, in my day job, I go around the country and see lots of cities, and it really follows on the point. Each of these places has a series of things which, with the proper organization design, as Michael said, could jumpstart something. What they can't all do is the same thing. Right. And so if you go around a lot of cities and everybody's chasing the same, sort of shiny object, the problem is it's going to kill. So there's common themes. 5G is an issue which every city has to deal with, and then getting it built in infrastructure, there are common views. Everybody has power, so to the point that there's a utility, there's a infrastructure around that utility. So we need to think about things which are innovative and scalable and also universally sort of available. The university systems are distributed through the country, and how you think about place in that way, because otherwise you'll end up with that continuing concentration of the resources, the capital, the talent into very narrow places. And so I think that's key. But on behalf of the business community, we push a lot, even on our relationship with what we do, like in Charlotte, our headquarters around schools and things. The business community is trying to say, how do we help, and how do we think about innovative ideas? But it's your system, but we can then, where do we interface from PK to third grade, to middle school STEM, to training principals, to community college, to technical education? Tell us where you need help, and then how do we scale it? And so I think scale and place are two things that the groups we have working have to think about differently.
Deborah, I wonder if you might want to comment. The council initiated, really back in the 90s, some pioneering work on regions of innovation clusters, and obviously this conversation has evolved tremendously over the past 15 or 20 years. What are you seeing as key attributes for this American innovation tapestry, and how the distinctive assets that we need to build upon?
Well, building on what our colleagues have said here, and thinking about design and designing new systems, clearly many of these big challenges and opportunities require public-private partnerships, and they require a different generation of partnerships among the different sectors, how academic institutions are working together, the national labs, companies, both in sectors and outside. I think we are still bearing the fruit of 30 years ago of tremendous innovation in public-private partnerships. We've done a lot of great work on technology transfer and commercialization and some one-off partnerships within, but we haven't done anything in 30 years to redesign the fundamental challenges of what we need to do for some huge things we must address. And the example I will give, there was a reference to 5G, and I hear others saying, well, the U.S. is behind because of our Federal Communications Commission and not being able to do things on a national scale. But the one that's really serious, and the Council's been working on this with Department of Energy and others and many in this room, if we do not lead as a nation in the development and deployment of the next generation advanced microelectronics systems beyond Moore's Law, everything we're talking about is going to be at huge risk. And we're not going to be able to do that with traditional venture capital, with a few partnerships between a few companies and maybe a few labs and universities. We have to do this in a big way and redesign the public-private partnerships for the big, critical things our country needs. And that's something that I believe and hope the Commission's going to really work on in a big way. And it's a new design frontier.
Mehmood, I think you wanted to...
I just want to... I guess we have to ask ourselves, to Deborah's point and some points that others have made, the innovation that we see come into the marketplace, whichever sector, obviously is an important driver. But there is a worrying investment issue underlying this as we look at what's happening in the US. And I think Brian's point was right on. You have to look at what you need to get done. However, think of it this way. For the first time in our history, we have more R&D investment in the industry sector, the private sector, than in the government sector. While you might look at that if you're on the industry side, and great, we're growing our investment, but for the most part, industry investment in R&D is an application-driven innovation engine. However, that pipeline dries up and ends if there isn't the basic research that goes there. And for anybody who spent any time in academic research, you actually don't know the end point and application in the majority of the research that's done. You sort of know the general direction, and so much of it is serendipity, chance, it happens, and so it's important to nurture that national ecosystem of creativity in that academic environment that then feeds into this. And just because industry stepped up and increased its investment is not necessarily a good thing, and I think to me, the macro public-private is how do we get the government and regional, state, national, whatever, to continue to invest in our academic and national lab infrastructure, because we on the industry side absolutely live off that, right? So that's the first thing. Yes, we need the capital, but there's no capital to deploy if I don't have an idea that I can actually do something with. So we need that. That's one important point, and I think it's got to be important as we think about this. To the point that was made, yes, we've got to do it in a broader geographic manner than just concentrated in 2 or 3 or 4 or half a dozen hubs as has happened right now. The second point in this is that if we're going to actually continue to do this in this new world, most of the new innovation that's happening is actually happening at the convergence of traditional disciplines. The traditional disciplines by which we've defined academic institutions, a department of biology, a department of engineering, a department of chemistry, those disciplines no longer work because the innovation that's happening isn't happening in those. Many biologists these days are more mathematicians than they were biologists. And yet we continue to look at, in many institutions, in these very traditional silos. And I think your institution's been one of the ones at the forefront. We have to ask ourselves, right down to that fundamental, how are we going to create ecosystems even within our institutions so that we truly create thought and idea generation, but also then to move that idea forward, which brings resources, right? And so these are all the things that our commission needs to now put on the table, and that's a key part of our work in the next couple of years as we bring this and hopefully bring recommendations and roadmaps to policymakers, leaders, academic leaders, but also private sector leaders.
And Lonnie, I know you and Brian both want to weigh in here. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and it's been mentioned a couple times, I've heard the word infrastructure. And, if we don't invest in the infrastructure in this country right now, our roads are crumbling, our bridges are crumbling, our grid system, electric grid system needs to be updated as we continue to transform into more wind, more solar. Wind is typically out in rural areas. It's not in the metropolitan areas, so you've got to have the grid system to provide that power where it needs, where the demand is. And we're a long ways from doing that. And if we don't start really investing in our infrastructure, high-speed rail, for example. I was in China a few years ago and got to experience riding on their high-speed rail. It's amazing. And you talk about other countries being advanced from us. I mean, they've got the opportunity to move a lot of people, in a fast manner, a safe manner, and bring people that live hundreds of miles away into the job site, and then get back on that high-speed rail and go home in the evening. So, mass transit, I mean, it's really everything that we do. If we're truly going to be continue to be a leader in worldwide technologies, we have to focus on infrastructure, because if we haven't got the roads, we haven't got the transportation, if we don't have safe drinking water for our families, there's water lines that there's still wood pipes in some areas of the country. There you got wood pipes that is taking water under that ground and leaking. Millions of gallons of water, by the way, are being leaked from that infrastructure. So we really have to focus on that if we are truly going to lead, I think, going forward in this country.
Brian, please.
Inherent in the discussion is the leadership of the United States through its education system, its research platform, but also in its acquisition of talent. Mm-hmm. And Mehmood told his personal story last night, but we have to get this straight, because the United States went from 170 million people working to 150 million people from 1969 to today. The population only went up by 100 million people, and a lot of that was immigration, because the natural population rate was relatively stable. If we think back to late 60s, early 70s, and all the different trends in society. So we have to get immigration right, and we have to be able to bring in talent to our universities. We have to be able to bring in talent to our companies and talent at all levels of the labor force, because we just aren't going to have enough population. So as much as we're talking about this aging population, can we activate them and keep them in the workforce longer? We're going to run out of people to have productivity can only go up so fast, and then the population is also the economy. Yeah. The unique thing about the United States is population grew and its economy grew, and that's why Europe, $17 to $18 trillion from before the crisis now, in total economy size. The United States, 14 to 20. And so we have to, and that was driven by all the stuff we're talking about, but also by people saying this is the best country to come and be in, and we can't forget that. And so there's bipartisan proposals. Any number of them will work. We just got to get something clarified so we can get going.
Thomas,
I just want to say, as a director of a national laboratory, I certainly endorse and support the idea that we need to continue to invest research and development dollars in infrastructure. But I think it's probably also important to recognize, if I look at the last 2 or 3 years, this is probably the best time in the national laboratory system where our budgets have seen a 30+% increase. And has resulted in new and improved infrastructure, or beginnings of new and improved infrastructure in important areas like industries of the future, artificial intelligence, quantum information science, advanced manufacturing or additive manufacturing, 5G, synthetic biology. So when I look at it, I think that we are at the cusp of turning things around. We need to do more. And I think this would be a really important time for the Commission to figure out how do we leverage these investments in infrastructure, in public-private, new and different public-private partnership, so that we become really engines of innovation.
We're running out of time. I want to mention an important point in time coming up, January 16th. We will be out at Arizona State University kicking off the major beginnings of the generative process for this National Commission. In the minute that we have left, anyone on the stage, a call to action, a charge, one thing you hope that many of the people in this room who will be with us out at ASU will take away, will bring to ASU, will help to create an idea, a thought, something perhaps to inspire folks as we begin our journey in 2020.
I don't think in the 30-year history of this commission, of this council, we've had a bigger initiative. And if not now, the old saying, then when? This is something that we're doing not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. And I think a lot of people can look back and say, what is it that we collectively did that changed the trajectory? We're actually trying to change a trajectory. That is never easy, but it can be done, and we've all the talent to do it. The only other comment I would make is January, I'm glad it's going to be in Arizona and not Minnesota.
Yes.
So.
The only thing I would add is that this really does give us an opportunity to put positive energy into the political system. So that if you think there's not enough positive energy, well, then we should label ourselves as guilty. What are we offering? What are the ideas we're putting on the table? What are the new designs that we're moving forward? How are we rethinking these things? And so people are hungry for how are we going to be competitive? How are we going to continue to be successful here in the United States? And so this is an opportunity. The whole commission is built on the positive, it's built on the constructive. It's built on the advancing of ideas to solve some of these issues, to move ourselves forward.
We've got to challenge ourselves, maybe 3 C's. We've got to be very curious, and it's got to be comprehensive. In other words, it can't just be incremental. So.
Great. I want to thank the panel. Much appreciation, and we look forward to working with you over the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.